also JSON object to define the default configuration settings. For example, let's have a setting here called name. That's the name of our application. Now, back in the configuration folder, let's add another file, development.json. In this file, we can define the settings specific to the development environment. As part of this, we can override the settings that we defined in default.json. We can also add additional settings. So here I can change the name, I can override it saying my express app development. We can also add additional properties here. And these properties can also be complex objects. For example, we can have a property called mail, where we store information about our mail server. So here we can have host, and let's set this to development mail server. Similarly, we can create another configuration file called production. So production.json. Now I'm going to go back in development.json, copy all this, paste it in production, and then change the name of the application as well as the address of the mail server. So prod mail server. So with this node package, you can easily see the default configuration as well as the configuration for each environment. It's very clean. It gives you a very clean structure. Now, back in our index.js, you can easily get various settings for our application. So, let's look at a few examples. Configuration. I'm going to do a console.log, application name. Now here we could use a template string, that doesn't really matter. The way we use this config object is like this. So it has a get method, and here as an argument we specify the name of a configuration property. So name. Now let's duplicate this. The other property I want to display is mail server. For this, we need to access this setting here, host, which is part of mail. The way we do this is using the dot notation, just like accessing properties of an object. So we want to get mail.host. Okay, now back in terminal, I'm going to put this machine in the development environment. So export node_env. We set this to development, and then run our application. So you can see application name is set to my express app development. This setting is coming from our development.json file. Similarly, our mail server is dev mail server. Okay. Now, if we change the environment to production, we're going to see different values. So export node_env. We set this to production and run the application one more time. Look, this time our mail server is prod mail server. So with this node package, you can easily store the configuration settings for your application. However, you should not store the application secrets in these configuration files. For example, you should not store the password of your database or your mail server, because when you check in your source code to a repository, that password or that secret is visible to anyone who has access to that source control repository. In fact, one of the famous financial companies in the US was hacked because someone checked in a password into source control repository. So the way we deal with these secrets is by storing them in environment variables. Let me show you how that works. So back in terminal, let's define an environment variable for storing the password of a mail server. So export password, we set it to 1234. Now, to prevent this environment variable to clash with another environment variable, it's better to prefix that with the name of our application. Now, in this demo, let's say the name of our application is app. So we add app underline as a prefix. Okay? So in development environment, we manually set this environment variable. And also in production environment, we'll most likely have a configuration panel for storing our environment variables. So we store all these passwords and secrets in our environment variables and then read them using our config module. Now back in the project, in the configuration folder, we need to add another file called custom-environment-variables. Make sure to spell it properly. The name of this file is very important. So custom-environment-variables.json. And in this file, we define the mapping of configuration settings to environment variables. So I'm going to go in our development.json file, copy all this into this new file. Now let's say here for the mail property, inside that we're going to have the property called password. Okay, so we want to map this to the environment variable that we created. That was app_password. Okay, now we don't need host because we are not going to map this to an environment variable. The value is defined in one of our configuration files. Delete. And for the same reason, we don't need name. So in this file, custom environment variables, we only have the mapping of our configuration settings to environment variables. Now back in index.js, let's duplicate this line and display the password of the mail server. So mail password. And we get that from mail.password property. So this config object looks at various sources to find a value for this configuration. The source can be a configuration file, a JSON file. It can be an environment variable. It can also be a command line argument. For that, you need to look at the documentation yourself. Now, back in terminal, let's run the application. Okay, look, our mail password is 1234, and this was read from an environment variable, not a configuration file. Again, this config package has a lot of useful features, and I leave it up to you if we are in the development environment. If yes, we enabled Morgan to log the HTTP requests, and we also log this message on the console. So this console.log is JavaScript programmers' oldest friend. We use it all the time for debugging. The problem with this approach, however, is that sometimes when we are done with them, we delete them or comment them out, but sometime later, we may need them, so we have to write the code again or remove the comment. This approach is very tedious. A better way to log messages for the purpose of debugging is to use the debug package in Node. With debug, we're going to replace all these console.log statements with a call to a debug function, and then we can use an environment variable to enable or disable debugging. This way, we don't have to come back to our code and modify the code. We don't have to delete these console.log or debug statements. We don't have to comment them out. We can control them from the outside using an environment variable. But more importantly, we can also determine the level of debugging information we want to see. Maybe sometime we're working on a database problem. Perhaps we only want to see the debugging information related to the database. So again, we don't have to come back to the code and modify all these console.log statements. So let me show you how to use the debug package. Back in the terminal, let's install debug. Beautiful. Now this is let's load the debug module. This require function here returns a function. So we call this function and give it an argument. And this argument is an arbitrary namespace that we define for debugging. For example, we can define a namespace like app:startup. Now, when we call this function with this argument, we get a function for writing debugging messages in this namespace. So let's call that function startup debugger. Startup debugger. Potentially, we can have another debugger for debugging database related messages. So once again, we load the debug module. We get a function. We call that function, give it a namespace like app:db, and this will return a debugging function. So we get it and store it in db debugger. Okay? Now here on line 9, we're going to replace this console.log statement with a call to startup debugger function. So startup debugger, like that. Now potentially, somewhere in the application we can have some database work, and there we may need to write some debugging information. So we can use our other debugger function, so db debugger, connected to the database. Something like that. Now we're going back to the terminal and use an environment variable to determine what kind of debugging information we want to see in the console. So here we set an environment variable called debug. We set this to app:startup. That means with this, we're going to see only the debugging messages that are part of this namespace, app:startup. Now, if you run the application, look, we got app startup, and here's our message. Now, next time I run this application, maybe I don't want to see any debugging information. So we can reset this environment variable to nothing, run the application again. Look, we no longer see this debugging message. Or we may want to see debugging messages for multiple namespaces. So we can set our environment variable to app:startup, app:db. With this, we will see the debugging messages in these two namespaces. Or if you want to see all the debugging messages for our app namespace, we can use a wildcard. This way we don't have to repeat each of them individually. Now when we run the application, look, we see the message is in different namespaces. So app startup and app DB. And the beautiful thing about this debug module is that it color codes the namespace. So we can easily distinguish the various debugging messages. We don't get that with console.log. Now there is also a faster way to set the level of debugging we want to see. So we don't have to explicitly set the environment variable using the export command. We can set the environment variable at the time of running our application. So let me clear the console. Let's say this time I only want to see debugging messages in app:/db namespace. So we said debug, set it to app:/db, now space, run our application either with Node or nodemon. So this is a shortcut to set an environment variable, in this case debug, and run the application at the same time. And one last thing. In this particular demo, I created two debugging functions, startup and db debugger. But in a real-world scenario, you may not necessarily need multiple debugging functions in the same file or in the same module. If that's the case, you can simplify your code by changing the name of this debugger function to debug. For example, in this file, let's say we don't have any database work. So I'm going to delete this. We only want to write debugging messages about the application startup. So let's delete this db debugger function. And now we can rename this function, startup debugger, to debug. So look, that's shorter than writing console.log. And it gives us a lot more power and control over how much of the debugging information we want to see. So prefer the debug module to console.log statements. Engine for the application. So we call app.set. The name of the property we need to set is view space engine, and the name of our view engine or templating engine is pug. So when we set this, Express will internally load this module. So we don't have to require it, okay? Now there is another setting that is not compulsory, it's optional, only if you want to override the path to your templates. So app.set, the name of the property is views, and the value is the path to where we store the templates. So the default value is /views. That means you should put all your views or all your templates inside a folder called views, which should be in the root of the application, right? Again, this is an optional setting. That's the default value, so we don't have to set that. Now, let's add a new folder here, views. Inside this folder, let's add a new file. We can call it index.pug. With pug, we can define our template using a syntax like this. So we can have an HTML element. Then inside that we can have head. Then we can have the title element. And we can set a value for this dynamically using the syntax. So we add an equal sign and then the name of a variable that we will set at runtime. I will show you how that works later. Now in parallel to head, we want to have another element called body. And inside that we want to have an h1. And we want to set the value for this dynamically using a variable called message. So you see pug has a cleaner syntax than regular HTML. We don't have those opening and closing elements. Of course, some people love it, some people hate it. But that aside, let's see how we can convert this to regular HTML and return it to the client. So back in our index module, earlier we defined a route for the root of the application. So here we send a simple message to the client, hello world, right? Now we want to replace this with an HTML markup and return it to the client. So instead of the send method, we use render. So response.render. Now as the first argument, we specify the name of our view. In that case, index, because the name of our file is index.pug. As the second argument, we pass an object, and this object includes all the values for the parameters that we have defined in our template, like title and message. So here I'm going to set two properties, title, my Express app, and message, hello. That's all we have to do. So now let's start the application again and head over to localhost port 3000. Look, we get HTML markup. We can verify that by looking at the source of this page. What you see here is our pug template converted to standard HTML. So we have HTML, head, title. This value is inserted dynamically at runtime. And then next to that, we have body. And inside this, we have this h1 element. So if you want to return HTML markup to the client, you use a view engine. Again, there are various view engines available like Pug, EJS, Mustache, and so on. But when you're building RESTful services for the backend of your client applications, you don't really need a view engine or a templating engine. I just covered this topic because I wanted my Node course to be comprehensive. Next, I'm going to If you look, here we have a very big file with 92 lines of code. And this is a very simple application. In the real-world application, you don't want to write all that code inside index.js. So in this lecture, I'm going to show you how to properly structure your application. The first thing we want to do is to take out all the code for this courses API and put it into a separate file. In other words, for every logical part of our application, for every API endpoint, we want to have a separate file or a separate module. So all the routes for working with courses should be in courses.js, and all the routes for working with, let's say, authors should be in authors.js. So in the root of the project, let's create a new folder, call it routes. Here we add a new file, courses.js. Now, back in index.js, let's select all the code for working with courses. Now, cut, back in courses, paste it here. Now, back in index.js, you can see here, we only have 40 lines. But first, let's finish refactoring the courses routes. So, back to courses.js. On the top, first we need to load express. So, constant express, we require it like this. Now, in index.js, we called express as a function, and we got an app object, right? But this approach does not work when you separate the routes in a separate module. So here we need to use a router. So this express has a method called router that returns a router object. Now here I'm going to rename this app to router for clarity. So press F2, router. So the difference is that in this module, in courses module, instead of working with the app object, we work with the router object. Okay? Now finally, at the end of this module, we export this router. So module that exports, we set it to this router. So in summary, we get the router on the top, we add routes to it, and finally export the router at the end of the module. Okay? Now we need to load this courses module inside index module. So back in index.js, here let's load the courses module. So require current folder / courses. Now we get this and store it in a constant called courses. And finally, once we load this module, we need to call app.use. Here we need to supply two arguments. The first argument is a path, so /API /courses. And the second argument is a router object that we imported, that is courses. Basically, we are telling Express that for any routes that start with /API /courses, use this router, the router that we loaded from the courses module. And with this, we can go back to our courses module and make our routes a little bit shorter. So back to the courses module on the top. See, every route here has this part, /API /courses. We don't want to repeat this everywhere because in index.js, we told Express that any routes that start with /API /courses should be handled by this courses router. So back in the courses module, we can get rid of all these /API /courses. So for the first route, which is for getting all the courses, our route will change to just a /. Same for the second route. For the third route, we have a parameter, so we'll only add /:id. Similarly, for the delete route, we only need /:id. And finally, the same for the last route here. So you can see our routes are much simpler now. Now back in index.js, I forgot to move the definition of our courses array into our courses module. So cut. Now back in courses module, on the top, here's our courses array. And that means our index module is now even shorter. It's only 37 lines of code. Now here's a simple exercise for you. I want you to refactor this route to the home page and put it in a separate file. So pause the video, do this exercise, and then you can come back and continue watching.
Men jag fattar inte. Antingen, jag är övertag.